So last week was Christmas, and now that we're through the Advent season, now that we're through the Christmas season, I want you to try to retell yourself the story of Christmas as you find it in the Gospels, okay? So if you were retelling yourself the Christmas story, maybe, it begins with the angel coming to Mary to announce the birth of Jesus, and then, Mary tells Joseph, and then the angel comes to Joseph and warns him, but they have to go to Bethlehem when she's pregnant, so they go to Bethlehem, but there's not a guest room for them, and then the baby Jesus is born and wrapped in swaddling clothing, and the angels come to the shepherds in the field, and like we looked at last week, they declare in Luke 2:14, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men. And then, they've got that beautiful scene, and the shepherds go and see the baby Jesus. And then, next the Magi come with their gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they give the gifts to the baby Jesus. And then the Christmas story is over, right? Except that it's not. Actually, in the story of the Gospels, there's one more scene that we often miss in the Christmas story after all of that. One more powerful scene, and one more scene that I think has so much to say to us today as we enter this new year. A scene that we shouldn't skip, even though it comes after all those other pieces of the Christmas story. All this last month in this Advent Christmas series, we have been talking about the messengers of Christmas. The different time that angels get in the Christmas story and they drive the story and the events forward, and just how involved that angels sent by God were in that first Christmas story. And there's this one last scene where angels get involved. This one last scene that we often leave out of the Christmas story, but is in it in the Gospels. And it says so much to us on this New Year's, a New Year's that we're looking forward to this 2024. So here's the beginning of this incredible story that we often ignore. It begins like this in Matthew 2, verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." Now, this is a very interesting scene. You see, back in 1 Kings chapter 19, the prophet Elijah is running for his life. He's running away from Jezebel, who wants to kill him, wants to murder him. And an angel of the Lord comes to him all the way back in 1 Kings 19, comes to Elijah and warns him, hey, Jezebel's going to kill you. You have to run. You have to go to Mount Horeb. Now, we're not exactly sure where Mount Horeb is located. However, the leading assumption is that it was in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Now, why did I tell you this Old Testament story? Because this New Testament story, the end of the Christmas story, begins just like that passage back in 1 Kings 19. It's an echo of that Old Testament story. Just like God came to Elijah through this angel and this dream and said, someone's about to kill you, Jezebel's about to kill you, run away to Egypt. Again, God sends an angel to Joseph this time and says, hey, King Herod is going to kill you. Get up, get up. Both of the stories, it says, get up, and go to Egypt to rescue your people. It's fascinating how it's an echo of this Old Testament story. Now, why would God do that? Well, it's because we worship the same God today that was worshiped in the New Testament and was worshiped in the Old, a God who protects his people. Now, why in the world would God say run away to Egypt? Well, there is protection there. There's protection there. You see, a few hundred years before the birth of Jesus, before Jesus' birth, there were these people, these Jewish people who actually immigrated to Egypt. At the time, a few hundred years before Jesus was born, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt. And the Ptolemies were very friendly to the Jewish people. And so you had all this big Jewish population moved into Egypt actually during that time. And now they've been established there as a minority group with their own neighborhoods, and they're established, and they've been established for a couple hundred years. And so now when Joseph and Mary and Jesus need to flee Israel, there's already been this population of other Jewish people set up in Egypt to protect them, because even though they didn't know they needed God's protection, God had been putting things in place to protect them for hundreds of years, because God is protecting us even when we need it. And it's just happening in another way with Joseph, Mary, and Jesus too. Because the question arises, like, they're basically going to be political refugees. Like, they're running all the way to another nation, all the way to another continent to get away from King Herod. So how in the world are they going to get money for a place to rent? How in the world are they going to get money to take care of their newborn baby? How in the world are they going to get money for clothes and food and just the necessities? God's already been taking care of them, hasn't he? Here's my guess, okay? Here's my assumption. When the wise men came, what did they give the baby Jesus? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Three of the smallest, most compact things that were valuable in the ancient world, in Israel at that time. And my guess is that they were able to take this gold, frankincense, and myrrh and travel with it to another nation and sell it there so they'd have money to establish this new life on another continent. So God was protecting them with those gifts days or weeks before they even needed it, because God is protecting us even before we need it. You don't know the next struggle you're going to go through. You don't know the next trial you're going to go through. You don't know the next tragedy you're going to go through. But you can know that God is already putting things in motion to protect you in the future. God is protecting us even before we know we need it. Verse 14, how's Joseph going to respond to this angel's warning to escape? Well, verse 14, so Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Now that's interesting, because that is a direct quote from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, which says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Now, if you study the book of Hosea, what you'll realize by the time you come to the 11th chapter is that this verse, "Out of Egypt I called my son," when it was written, it wasn't first understood as looking forward to the Messiah. Now, I think it meant that too, of course, but it wasn't first understood as looking forward to the Messiah, but looking back at the past promises of God. Now, what promise is it looking back at? Well, it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Wait, who is your son? At the beginning of Hosea 11:1, it says, well, Israel, when Israel was a child. So it's trying to remind you of the story of the time that all of God's people, Israel, they were captured and enslaved in Egypt. And what does God do through the Exodus? He calls his son Israel. He calls the people of Israel out of Egypt. He rescues them and he redeems them. Why is Matthew reminding us of this story? Well, again, it's an echo from the Old Testament, relived again in the new. Because whether it was God returning all of Israel from Egypt through the Exodus, all of Israel through this exile in Egypt, and he was rescuing them out of Egypt, or whether it was God returning Jesus, the baby Jesus, the child Jesus, from Egypt to the promised land of Israel, or whether it's God rescuing you and I from spiritual exile, the spiritual exile and separation that our sin creates between us and him, God is always in the business of rescue and return and redemption. Now, what's happening here practically is very easy to understand. King Herod was just an awful, awful, and cruel king. This evil pretender of a king, King Herod, well, he had heard that the Messiah had possibly been born. He wants to remain king, so what he's doing is he's attempting to murder all the baby boys in the area. All the baby boys in the area. But the angel sent by God tells Joseph, hey, you got to go on this family road trip. You got to get your family to Egypt. You got to escape, right? But they're not traveling in a Kia hitting up the Denny's, okay? No, they're traveling on foot. And many scholars guess, we don't know this from the scriptures, but many scholars, they guess that they were headed towards the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And according to Google Maps, that means that they traveled about 664 miles on foot. This was a miserable, miserable trip. This was not an easy little car day trip, right? This is a hard trip. There would have been nights in those weeks of travel, maybe those months of travel, where Joseph probably laid awake like, what am I doing? How in the world did I get here that I'm traveling across continents to escape a king? He probably didn't feel in some moments like God was protecting him. But God is protecting us even when we don't feel it. And look, when he was living for a year or 2 or 3 years down in Egypt, again, as a political refugee, probably not doing great, money. We're trying to figure all that out, living in a new land with a new language and a new political. There were probably some nights he went to sleep like, what am I doing? What am I doing? This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel good. But here's the thing. God's protecting us even when we don't feel it. Even when he didn't feel it, God was still protecting Joseph and his family. Even if you're in a hard spot in life and things don't feel right, even if you're going through a trial in life and you don't feel God protecting you, you don't feel God guiding you, he is. He is. Even when things aren't going how you hoped, you never know how God is actually using it to protect you. God is protecting us even when we don't feel it. Back to Matthew 2, verse 16. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious and he gave orders to kill all the baby boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. I mean, that's horrific, right? That's awful. King Herod can't trick the Magi into giving up, disclosing the location of the Messiah. But he's so intent on keeping his grip on power that he can't imagine a world where this Messiah is allowed to live. So instead of taking a chance of no longer being in control, he takes the sure thing and simply murders every last little boy in the entire region. I mean, it's incomprehensibly cruel. It's horrific, and yet Joseph and Mary don't even know it happened. Like they're in another country. I'm sure later on, years later, they heard about it. Maybe months later, they heard about it, but they don't know about when it's happening. So think about this. They don't even know the tragedy that God had just saved them from. Like when they're down there in Egypt, they don't even know the heart-wrenching heartache that God had just protected them from. But that's the thing. God is protecting us even when we don't know it. God is protecting us even when we don't know it. You will never know all the situations God has saved you from. You will never know all the pitfalls God has protected you from. You will never know all the tragedies that God has shielded you from. God is protecting us even when we don't know it. Verse 19. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. So the angel returns, but now the message from the angel isn't to run, but to return to Israel. And again, Joseph is so obedient. He's so faith-filled. He immediately gets up and does precisely what God said through the message of the angel and goes back. Verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, I'm going to assume again by an angel, having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So after Herod died, his kingdom was actually divided into three different parts. Three different sons of Herod take over, and the kingdom is divided between these three sons, Antipas, Philip II, and Archelaus. And Archelaus was given the lands of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, which included Galilee. But this dude was so cruel, so incredibly cruel. So God steps in yet again to protect this family, to protect Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus and the young child Jesus. And he gives them this message to don't go home to Galilee. You got to go somewhere else. You got to go to a different part of Israel named Nazareth. Now, I'm guessing, being a carpenter, that Joseph wasn't like a super expert in all the ins and outs of this family political drama. And not being a fortune teller, I'm guessing he didn't know the future of where he should best raise his child. And yet, God protects him. And God delivers this message of where to go to help his family in the future. Because God is protecting us even when we don't know what is to come. Even when we don't know what the future is going to hold, God is already putting things in place to protect us. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You don't know how God is getting things ready in your life right now to protect you in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. God is protecting us even when we don't know what is to come. And that's the end of how the Gospels address the Christmas story, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew. Twice we've now read that this angel of the Lord intervenes to talk to Joseph and deliver these incredible messages of protection, because God protects his people. Even when things were unsettled, even when things were worrying, even when things felt very vulnerable, God still stepped in and protected his people. And here's where I think it has something to say to us today and right now on the cusp of the new year, because I've noticed a shift in how people often think about New Year's now. Because in the past, there was so much excitement and hope and optimism, and there's still some of that, but I think more than ever, people are feeling unsettled about what the future is, vulnerable and worried about what's to come. I mean, as I've talked to people over the last month about the new year, a lot of times I hear people talking about things that are worrying. What if there's a recession? How about these wars? This, lack of a real solid institutions, and just people worried about the year to come, with those feelings of being unsettled and vulnerable and worried and precarious. But here's the thing: you don't have to feel that way. You can approach this new year with hope. You can approach this new year with optimism. You can approach this new year knowing that God is going to be with you, protecting you along the way, because God protects his people. Yeah, you might not know everything that you're going to need protection for yet. And yet, God is protecting us even when we don't know we need it. Yeah, there's some rough patches where you look around, you feel like maybe God isn't there protecting you, but you know what? God is protecting you even when you don't feel it. You might not know all the ways that God has looked out for you and helped you and saved you and protected you, and yet God is protecting you even when you don't know it. And you don't know what is to come. You don't know what you're going to need protection from. You don't know what's to come. You don't know what's coming up in the future. And yet God is protecting you even when you don't know what is to come. Because God protects his people.